Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Professor Heidi Campbell. I'm a professor of communication and a presidential impact fellow at Texas A&M University. And today I'm here to talk to you about the digital turn and the future of theological education. Now, I have been tasked to look at three different areas of questioning in my presentation. And so I'm drawing on three book publications that I have. One is Network Theology, which looks at how network theory can help give us a framework and a new way of looking at theology. The second book is What Should Post-Pandemic Religion Look Like? And here is a synopsis of research that my husband and I did over the pandemic about churches online and what some of the current trends are post-haste. And then finally, the book Digital Religion, which is forthcoming at the end of 2022, and looking at some of the key characteristics of practicing religion online. So the first question I was asked to respond to was, what changes in digitality and technology are affecting the world today? So we can see now in the 21st century that digital media has become embedded in our society. And to many of us, it just seems like second nature. But over the 30 years that I've been studying digital media and teaching about it, we can go back and see that at one time, it was a really revolutionary generation of technologies. Digital media are defined by a number of traits, but three I wanted to highlight for you are: one is interactivity, and that means that messages can be modified as they are sent. Interactivity means that you don't just consume a message, but you can actually use that message to produce additional content. You have the ability to engage and respond, not just to view or to tune out of. A second characteristic of digital media is that it's audience generated. At one time, if you wanted to produce a TV show or a film or a music, you had to have access to expensive equipment, and you had to have a lot of professional skills and training. But with the newer technologies, you don't need to know how to code to create a website. You don't need to know the intricacies of audio production to produce a podcast. The new technologies that we have created platforms that do what we call lower the barriers to entry and allow more people to access to both produce the media as well as consume it. And a third important characteristic is asynchronous communication, which means the information or data is distributed across time. I like to tell my students that at one time, synchronous communication was the standard, i.e. a message went out, and if you didn't have your radio on or weren't in front of the television, you would miss it. That was your one chance. But in an age of digital media, consumers now get to choose when and how and in what platform or format they want to engage with information. So we can see these traits of interactivity, audience-generated technologies, and asynchronous communication put a lot of control in the hands of the users that they didn't have before. So if we compare the era of mass media, which was defined by television, film, radio, and newspaper, we see that media was very much a static space. You got the newspaper, you got the magazine, you watched the film, and you got the story that was given to you by the producers of that piece. And you often had very firm constraints of when and how you engage with that media. The way media was created was using light and sound and different technologies. For example, I used to work in the radio industry and we had these big electronic reel-to-reels where we actually would record on this electronic tape, and we would physically cut and slice and put together with electronic tape broadcast. So if you lost something on the floor, it was lost forever. So media was very much one person's perspective, a story that went in one direction, a linear format. So mass media gave us stories that provide us a window into the world of the writers, the producers, and the people who paid for and put together that media. But in a digital media age, that has been turned on its head. Instead, media space is engaged space. Consumers become also producers, or what we call prosumers of media. So I can listen to media, but if I take a digital picture, right now, I could take that and very easily make it the background of this PowerPoint. I could make a T-shirt out of it. I could turn it into a meme and kind of even manipulate the image. And so we see media is much more dynamic. The way it's shared and where it's stored information in a database format and through digital data allows it easier for people to manipulate it and work with it. And so this means that what digital media gives us is a control panel, a way to control or a way to represent our own understanding of the world in digital media. And so we can see that this is, it's not only that digital media has changed, but we also see over the last 2 decades a real shift in how our social relationships and practices have changed. And these have been influenced by the conditions of what's called the network society. So what is the network society? Well, Manuel Castells defined it as the social relationships are increasingly decentralized and interconnected through a social technical infrastructure. That means the way we communicate with one another, how we do our work, how we educate, and even how we do church is being informed and shaped by social technical information and means. Digital media is playing a role, and so it mediates reality, and it gives people more control and more variability. So as we become more and more dependent on digital media and screens to communicate, to share information, to do our work, we see that it's changing how we see the world in many respects. One of the key changes that Castells point to is that we see a loosening of traditional social boundaries and practices. For example, it no longer is it just the teacher who has access to information. With the internet, students can be fact-checking what a teacher says in class if they have access to a digital device. Similarly, the same thing happens with pastors. People can fact check what they're saying, but they can also go look up different commentaries of what other people or other pastors might have commented on that same passage that's being talked about. So we see this much that the power of media producers is lessened, and the influence and abilities of the audience has been lifted up. And so these changes are not just affecting, our work, our education, our government and politics. It's affecting the world of religion and the church. The church in the digital age reflects a lot of these changes that we're seeing in internet culture and technology, and increasingly it's becoming networked. So like these images on the screen, at one time, people thought of churches in terms of parishes, and you would go to the church that was closest to you and with your the affiliation that your family may be part of or that you were raised in. We saw throughout the 20th century the move toward kind of these larger churches that were very dependent on technology to function, and they were became these kind of mega churches that were connections. And toward the end of the 21st century, we saw the kind of rise of multi-site churches. And these are churches, again, that instead of a model of going to the one down the street, you can choose the church you go to. And that church might not just even have one space, but multiple spaces that are a combination of online and offline. And so we've seen over the last 100 years this change that our social relationships and how churches function have become much more networked. They've become very more dynamic, and individual churches or denominations have the ability to change their relationships as well as individuals, and very much a media-driven culture. So these are some of the conditions that digital technology and the conditions of the network society have ushered in for us. The second question I was asked to address was, how does the digital alter people's communication and sense of presence and relationship? And again, there's many things we could talk about, but I just want to highlight some characteristics that I talk about in this forthcoming book, Digital Religion, The Basics. So through my research over the last especially 20 years, I've noticed that there's 5 kind of ways or characteristics of how people practice religion online. And I would also argue this is not just a new or unique to religion, but this also shows how people practice their social relationships, education, and their daily lives have changed through digital media. One is convergent practice, and this is the blending of information and rituals that we can converge and bring together multiple sources through digital media. And so we aren't just dependent on one source. Multi-site reality is the understanding that our online and offline connections are no longer divorced from one another, but they're embedded and interconnected in one another. And so we live in a world that has, sometimes we're online, sometimes we're offline, and it's this combination of realities that we switch between. Network community means that our understanding of community has shifted drastically in the last 2 centuries. From community used to be defined in terms of your family, the geography you lived, or the institutions that you affiliated with. But now in a network culture, it puts the individual at the center of those choices rather than institutions. And so I can choose to what extent what networks I'm involved in, how I connect them, and how much time I invest in one or another. So again, more loosely bound social relationships that are individually directed. A fourth characteristic I call storied identity. And this means my identity, whether it's a religious identity or a political identity, I have the opportunity through digital media to choose how I'm going to create that identity and then act it out. Every time I join a social media platform, it asks me to choose, not just kind of, who I am, but what kind of words I want to be identified with, what kind of aspects of the internet I want to link to me, and to show things that I like or don't like. So we see that the internet is always forcing us to make these choices about who we are and how we represent ourselves. Again, being able to self-directed rather than top down our institutions or our churches telling us how to do that. And finally, we live in a space of shifting authority. No longer are the traditional gatekeepers of theologians, religious leaders, pastors, the ones that kind of determine what information we have access to and who we see as kind of our religious sources of influence. So we see kind of digital media empowers new voices to come forth, as well as it gives new religious institutions that take the time to learn about it new opportunities to kind of spread their influence in a digital space. So I want to talk just really briefly about the first two of these characters in a little more depth because we really saw them come to out in a new way during the pandemic. So the first, the idea of convergent practice, it argues that the internet serves as a spiritual hub, allowing people to assemble their personalized religious belief and behaviors. So this means that spirituality now is multi-sourced. Again, I may go to a certain church offline, but online I have the opportunity to maybe download apps from different religious communities or traditions or denominations. So I may get my daily devotional from this one source. I may go on this app for a prayer request. I may go to this other source to study the scripture. And so people's religious life is very much becoming self-directed by the different tools and opportunities that are out there. And this became very evident during the pandemic as churches in mass moved online because many of them not having other options to gather during the pandemic. So the church online began to reflect this convergent practice. They were having to draw from multiple sources, both digital and online, to create their services, as well as kind of think about how to do community worship and fellowship and gathering. Some of them use what I call the transfer strategy, where they brought the video camera into the church, but they had to decide, well, what part of the church are we going to film, and how is the technology going to dictate, maybe how we move and how we do the service. Other churches took what I call a translation strategy, and they not only tried to not only did the digital media force them to change maybe where they did the service, but what it looked like. So many pastors did sermons in maybe their home or in a study, trying to give it more informal feels, saying that, hey, I can't be with you in person, and so I'm going to kind of create a new space, so welcome you into my home and make it more friendly and relatable. And others saw that all the resources of digital media allowed them opportunities to really even transform traditional liturgy and rituals. My friend here from the UK, this is a picture from her service online during Palm Sunday. And so she got the idea of get members of her congregation to put a palm in their hand and then email those to her. And then she created a little video to kind of reenact the physical pilgrimage they would make around their town for Palm Sunday. So using digital media, photography, video, she was able to recreate this ritual to kind of connect people to this in this opportunity. So again, our practice is changing because of our digital media. We also see multi-site reality, this idea of the church being in many places became a reality, even for the smallest of congregations. Multi-site reality recognizes the interconnectedness and embeddedness of online and offline engagement. During the pandemic, we saw that the church was forced to become multi-spaced. There was still some times for offline engagement, but much of the community work, fellowship, Bible studies had to happen online. And so the church had to kind of determine, well, how are we going to connect the online and offline? To what extent are we going to offer something new or try to replicate? So kind of thinking of the church as existing in not just one space, but multiple spaces was a real challenge. Also, people's online experience, we see, is informed by their people's offline experience began to be informed by their online expectations and vice versa. So, you would hear a lot of talk in some churches or in online forums about what they missed or what they felt was different. And so they began comparing the online and offline context. So, in many ways, the multi site reality became the new normal, as well as a challenge for many churches. And many churches were conflicted about online. They'd been told pre pandemic that digital media and technology is something to resist or has problematic values. And now they were asked to being able to embrace this. They also were conflicted about, what was it doing to the nature of worship as they went online. And the online also raised important question about what constitutes community and practices. Just because we're connected and we're seeing maybe one another on a Zoom profile, are we really enacting community? So what are the limits of online rituals? So the online space and the pandemic experience became an experiment in these new characteristics of digital media. And finally, which changes should churches and religious communities pay attention to? Well, I'd like to highlight from this small book, What Should Post-Pandemic Religion Look Like? Some of the trends that we highlight and what we saw of how people practice religion online, the things that they liked, the things that they pushed against, what maybe religion as we come out of the pandemic should look like, and things that religious institutions should consider. So one is digital experimentation revealed the power of technology many religious groups were unaware of. Again, they've moved from a place of seeing technology in a hostile or being fearful of it to embracing it. And that was a great transformation for many groups, especially seeing what digital media could do in connecting people, in enlarging their congregation, and giving more options to people to meet and connect with one another. We also saw that recreating worship spaces online spotlighted what religious groups see as their core beliefs and practices. Again, going back to listening in some of the online kind of fellowship hours or coffee hours after church, when you'd hear people talk about what they missed about an online service, it really told you what their priorities were. For some people, it was the priority of hearing that sermon, and that was church for them. Others kind of said, church for me is that coffee hour afterwards where I can actually connect with other believers. And for some, it was, it was the mass experience. It was about communion. And some of those events were easy to replicate online and others weren't. But it told about kind of people's liturgical values that it was surprising to many religious leaders. And finally, the forced re-examination of what makes a faith community and a church true expression religion was something that was faced. Again, a lot of pastors in 2020 realized, wow, just because we're using social media and we're networking people together, that doesn't mean we've created a church that has a social experience and that feels like a community. Groups began to evaluate, what is it that makes us a faith community? What allows us to share our faith? What allows us to interact and really function as a community? So kind of definitions of church began to kind of evaluate to what extent have we become maybe too event focused and geographic focused, rather than maybe some of these core practices that we're called to. So in summation, if I was given some advice to the Asian Theological Association of things to pay attention to or questions to ask, I would say this. First, I think religious groups and associations need to test and continue some of these digital practices beyond the crisis. That doesn't mean that everything we adopted during the pandemic should stay, but I think hybrid worship and hybrid church in some forms, especially for some communities, should be something continued. But churches and church leaders need to see how do they balance the two, the online and the offline traditional congregation, so they both feel part of the church family. Secondly, religious leaders need digital training and literacy for future success. In a research report that we put out called Pastors Put on the Tech Hat, they said that technology training was the thing they were least prepared for and the least thing that they expected they would have to do during the pandemic. Many leaders didn't even have experience of running a video camera or didn't even know how to run the soundboard. And so when they had to make choices about digital media, they found it very stressful. So here, training our religious leaders, future pastors, and educators of how to use technology and the basics, so at least they can make choices or bring on people to help them in these decision making is important. And finally, integrating technology into religious communities requires a team-based approach and empowering digital creatives. Unlike some things, it can't be done by one person alone. Expecting the pastor to run the video camera, record the device, get it online, it's a lot to put on one person. And so for many of these things, when technology comes, it means bringing new people with new skills into your congregation or leadership setting. And that means partnering with those digital creatives, those people that may have either a passion for technology or have skills, and bring them into kind of maybe the ministry team in ways we wouldn't have thought of, like someone with digital media skills or recording skills. They might not be seen as that being a spiritual gift or important gift to the church, but they are. And so team-based work will definitely alleviate the stress from leaders and make this work more vibrant. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share on these topics with you. I encourage you, if you're interested in any of these issues, to look further at my work and the books that I've mentioned, and our Technology in Churches During COVID-19 report. And I hope that these give you some ideas that challenge you, that inspire you, and get good conversations going. Thank you.